On the night of November 10th, 1973, two cousins drove out to a rural cabin about 20 miles north of Nashville, Tennessee, broke in, and waited in the dark for the homeowner to return. The cousins had chosen this house specifically because they knew exactly where the homeowner was, because they'd been listening to his live performance on the radio. The homeowner was David Akeman, a beloved country music star, and the cousins had heard rumors that he didn't trust banks and instead kept his cash hidden inside his cabin. What those cousins didn't know was that within hours, they would commit a double murder so brutal that it would change Nashville forever. And 50 years later, Music City would still be haunted by what happened that night. David Akeman, better known to millions of Americans as Stringbean, was born on June 17, 1915, in Annville, Kentucky, into a musical family. His father, James Akeman, played banjo at local dances, and young David fell in love with the instrument early. According to some accounts, he traded a pair of prize bantam chickens for his very first banjo when he was just 12 years old. He spent his early years scraping by however he could, even joining the Civilian Conservation Corps during the Great Depression. But music was always his calling. He eventually won a talent contest judged by musician Asa Martin and was invited to join his band. During an early performance, Martin forgot his name on stage and just called him Stringbean because of his tall, lanky build, and that name stuck for the rest of his life. By the 1940s, Stringbean was playing banjo for none other than the bluegrass legend Bill Monroe. In 1945, he married a Maury County, Tennessee woman named Estelle Stanfield, and that same year he joined the Grand Ole Opry. He soon teamed up with his close friend Grandpa Jones, and the two of them became fixtures of Opry comedy for decades. Stringbean was famous for his unforgettable stage costume, a long nightshirt tucked into a pair of blue jeans, belted around his knees, which made him look like a very tall man with very tiny legs. He scored country hits with songs like Chewing Gum and I Wonder Where Wanda Went. And then in 1969, his fame really took off when he and Grandpa Jones joined the cast of a brand new variety show called Hee Haw. As you probably know, Hee Haw became one of the most successful variety shows in television history. Stringbean played the scarecrow in the cornfield, the one who delivered one-liners before being shouted down by the crow on his shoulder. He had other segments on the show as well, and was generally known as a warm and funny individual. But despite all the fame, Stringbean and his wife never lived like stars. Instead, they lived in a tiny cabin out on 2308 Baker Road near Ridgetop, Tennessee, just outside Goodlettsville, about 20 miles north of Nashville. Their friend and singer Ramona Jones described the couple as sweet, gentle people that loved nature and spent most of their free time fishing on a creek. They were modest, hardworking, and devoted to each other. They had no children, and according to friends, their only real indulgences in life were a Cadillac and a color TV. Stringbean had grown up during the Great Depression and had watched banks collapse and take people's life savings with them. So he simply did not trust banks. Instead, he kept his money on him or hidden in the cabin. He'd even sewn special pockets into his overalls and in Estelle's clothing so they could carry their cash with them wherever they went. Around Nashville, it became a well-known piece of gossip that Stringbean carried wads of $100 bills in his overalls. His friend and neighbor, musician Lester Armistead, later told the Tennessean, String flashed money, mostly to his friends. He was so happy that he was making a living playing a banjo and that he got to live on a farm doing what he wanted. And that was the danger, because while it was friends and family who saw the cash, there were two other men who heard the rumors too, and they had every intention of taking some of that money for themselves. Those men were 23-year-old cousins John A. Brown and Marvin Douglas Brown, who most people called Doug. On the night of November 10, 1973, the Browns drove out to the Akemans' cabin on Baker Road, broke in, and proceeded to tear the place apart looking for the money everyone in Nashville had been talking about. They turned the cabin upside down, but couldn't find Stringbean's stash, so they did something even more chilling. They turned on the Akemans' radio and tuned in to the live broadcast of the Grand Ole Opry so they would know exactly when Stringbean and Estelle were coming home. After Stringbean's Opry performance, he and Estelle loaded up into their car with about $5,000 in cash hidden in those special pockets sewn into their clothes, equivalent to over $30,000 today. With Estelle in the passenger seat, Stringbean drove the 20 miles north back to their little cabin on Baker Road, completely unaware of what was waiting for them inside. When they pulled up to the cabin, Stringbean immediately noticed that something wasn't right. So he grabbed the .22 pistol he carried for protection and walked up to the cabin alone, telling Estelle to wait. He opened the door and was met by the Brown cousins, who were still inside. The exact sequence of what happened next has been disputed over the years, with each of the cousins later blaming the other for firing the shots. But what is undisputed is this: Stringbean was shot and killed inside the cabin. When Estelle heard the gunshots, she got out of the car and started running for the road, screaming for help. One of the Browns chased her down and shot her in the back of the head. According to later testimony, she had begged for mercy before he killed her. After the shootings, the Browns made off with what they could grab, which, in a cruel twist of fate, ended up being almost nothing. They got Estelle's purse, a few firearms, including a gun that had been gifted to Stringbean by Grandpa Jones, and just $250 that they found in Stringbean's overalls pocket. As for the money sewn into their clothes, they never found any of it. The next morning, Grandpa Jones, who was the Akemans' next-door neighbor and Stringbean's best friend, drove over to the cabin, as he and Stringbean had been planning a hunting trip together that day. What he found is something no human being should ever have to see. Estelle's body was outside in the yard near the road, while Stringbean's body was inside. Grandpa Jones immediately called the police, and within hours, all of Nashville knew, and the country music community was absolutely shattered. The murders were a turning point for the entire city of Nashville, as up until that night, Nashville's country music community had operated on something close to total trust. Doors were often left unlocked, and deals were made on handshakes. Almost overnight, country music stars across Nashville began installing security systems, adding deadbolts, and buying guard dogs, which marked the end of an era of innocence in Music City. Fortunately for the Akeman family, this case didn't stay unsolved for long. The Brown cousins worked at the Union 76 truck stop off Interstate 24 in Antioch, Tennessee. Fueled by drugs and alcohol, they bragged to coworkers about the botched robbery and murders. One of the coworkers would later provide investigators with this information, leading to the cousins' arrest on January 16, 1974, 67 days after the murders. At their trial, Grandpa Jones himself took the stand and testified against them, providing what turned out to be damning evidence. One of the firearms recovered from the cousins was a gun that Grandpa Jones had personally given to Stringbean as a gift, and he recognized it immediately. Both John A. Brown and Marvin Douglas Brown were found guilty and sentenced to 2 life sentences, totaling 198 years in prison. Each defendant blamed the other for the shooting, but under Tennessee's felony murder rule, it didn't matter who pulled the trigger. Since both men had participated in a felony, a burglary, that resulted in death, both of them were legally guilty of murder, regardless of who fired the fatal shots. Doug Brown spent the rest of his life behind bars, died of natural causes in 2003, and was buried in the prison cemetery. John Brown, on the other hand, was released on parole on November 3, 2014, after serving 41 years in prison. The story doesn't end here, though, because in 1996, the new owner of Stringbean's cabin was doing some work around the home when he made a stunning discovery behind a loose brick in the chimney. There, hidden away, just like the rumors said, was about $20,000 in cash. Unfortunately, by the time it was discovered, it had been there for over 2 decades, and rodents had gotten to most of it. The vast majority of the cash had been chewed and destroyed beyond recognition, and very little of it was actually salvageable. Stringbean and Estelle are buried together at Forest Lawn Memorial Gardens in Goodlettsville, Tennessee. After his death, Hee Haw continued to air Stringbean's previously taped segments, with his final episode airing on March 23, 1974. For the remainder of the show's production, the scarecrow in the cornfield was left untouched as a memorial to the man who once delivered punchlines from that spot. In the early morning hours of April 15, 2019, in the small town of Earle, Arkansas, firefighters were called out to a mobile home on Bailey Street. The home was engulfed in flames, so intense that the heat had begun to melt part of a car in the driveway. When crews finally got the fire under control, they made a horrifying discovery. Inside were the bodies of 25-year-old Chassidy Brown, her 5-year-old son Josiah, and her 42-year-old friend Kendrick. Chassidy and Kendrick had both been shot to death, but Chassidy had initially survived before she and her son, Josiah, sadly died from smoke inhalation. While investigators would quickly track down and arrest a suspect, the person would never go to trial, and 7 years later, the case sits in limbo. Chassidy Chantel Brown, who went by the nickname Beatty, was born on November 24, 1993, and was just 25 years old in April of 2019. She was the mother of 5-year-old Josiah, who by every account was the joy of his entire family's life. The third victim that morning was 42-year-old Kendrick Jones, who was a local barber who cut just about everybody's hair in town. He and Chassidy were longtime friends who had never been involved in a romantic relationship. However, the suspect assumed otherwise, which is what ultimately led to this horrible tragedy. Chassidy had unfortunately been in a relationship with a man named Ezekiel Lindsay, who was allegedly a very jealous individual who had allegedly threatened Chassidy in the past. A few months before the murders, Craighead County, Arkansas, prosecutors filed charges against Lindsay for residential burglary, criminal mischief, and 2 counts of second-degree stalking that occurred on Christmas Day 2018 against Chassidy. He then became a wanted fugitive, but because he was transient and was moving between different counties in eastern Arkansas, it made it difficult to track him down. Then came the morning of April 15, 2019. Sometime around 12:30 a.m., 911 calls came pouring in about a mobile home fully engulfed in flames on Bailey Street in Earle, Arkansas. Firefighters arrived and battled the blaze, and when they made entry, they found Chassidy, Josiah, and Kendrick all dead inside. According to the medical examiner, both Chassidy and Kendrick had been shot before the fire started. However, Kendrick died from his gunshot wounds, while Chassidy and Josiah both died of smoke inhalation, meaning that when the fire was set, they were still alive. Turns out there was also a 4th victim, Chassidy's unborn child, whom she was 8 months pregnant with. As for who the father was, that remains unknown, but it's possible Lindsay was the father, or at least he might have thought he was. For about 2 months, investigators worked the case quietly. They theorized that Lindsay had broken into her home, saw Kendrick, assumed they were dating, and shot and killed him. It's then alleged that he turned the gun on Chassidy before setting the home ablaze. On June 23, 2019, Lindsay was arrested in Brinkley, Arkansas, and charged with 3 counts of capital murder. For the families, it felt like justice was finally on its way. A trial date had even been set for December 9, 2019, and the families of the victims were actively pushing for the death penalty. However, before ever going to trial, the case took an unexpected turn. Over the next year, Lindsay's defense team filed several motions to have evidence in the case suppressed. Through a combination of factors, including clerical errors made by the court itself, misfiled paperwork that wasn't found until after a key hearing, and pandemic-related court shutdowns that made Arkansas's speedy trial law a serious problem. Prosecutors found themselves in an absolutely impossible situation. Without the suppressed evidence, a conviction would have been almost impossible. So the state took a legal action known as nolle prosequi, meaning they chose to drop the case for the time being rather than risk going to trial and losing, which would trigger double jeopardy. What the suppressed evidence was has never been publicly released. 2 days after his release, he was immediately arrested on the outstanding warrant from neighboring Craighead County and was officially charged with residential burglary, criminal mischief, and 2 counts of second-degree stalking that occurred on Christmas Day, 2018. However, Lindsay would get lucky once again, and in 2020, these charges, just like the murder charges, were dismissed due to lack of evidence. The Jones family has since expressed disappointment over the handling of the case by investigators. The capital murder charges against Lindsay have never been refiled, and he is innocent unless proven guilty in a court of law. In the years since, the Brown family has tried to make sure their loved ones are remembered for who they were in life, not just how they died. Chassidy's brother, Brad Brown, helped clean up the burned property on Bailey Street so that the charred home wouldn't stand as a constant reminder of the worst day of their lives.